Was there ever someone you refused to work with?
Vader.
Vader.
Oh, he broke my sternum. I asked him, "What the hell's going on with you, man? What the hell happened out there?" And he's like, "I'm sorry, Jake. I just get so excited because the people are so into you, man. And they were all just really amped up. I just lost control." Really?
They bullied him, and the man saying that is Jake Roberts, the Snake, one of the sharpest minds in the history of professional wrestling. A man who lived through the worst of it, watched it happen to others, and has spent his later years finally telling the truth about what went on behind those locker room doors. Jake is not guessing. He is not repeating rumors he heard secondhand. He was there. He sat in those locker rooms. He shared those corridors with the men doing the bullying. He saw the faces. He heard the screams. He felt the damage on his own body. And now he is naming names. All of them, without flinching, because the truth matters more than the old code of silence. This is a story about 10 wrestlers who were bullied backstage. 10 people who walked into one of the most brutal workplace cultures in the history of sport and paid a price that nobody should ever have to pay. Some of them were physically hurt, bones broken, bodies damaged. Some of them had their careers quietly dismantled by men who smiled to their face and stabbed them in the back the moment they turned around. Some of them were broken down psychologically over weeks and months and years until they had nothing left to give, and all of them deserve better than what they got. If you want more stories like this, use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype, because this stuff was real and it needs to be heard. These were real people, real careers, and real pain. Keep that in mind as we go through every single name on this list. To understand what these 10 people went through, you have to understand the world they walked into. The professional wrestling locker room of the 1980s and 1990s was not like any other workplace on this earth. It was a closed society. It ran on its own laws and its own logic. It had its own judges and its own punishments. And not a single thing that happened inside that society was ever supposed to leave the building. There was no HR department. There was no grievance procedure. There was no external authority you could appeal to. The locker room was the law. And the locker room answered to nobody. The men who built that world called it tradition. They called it paying dues. They told the younger talent that the process of being humiliated and tested and pushed to breaking point was actually good for them, that it would make them harder, that it would prove they belong, that surviving the treatment of the veterans was the only real qualification that mattered. And for a while, everyone accepted that because everyone was afraid to say otherwise. But Jake Roberts is not afraid anymore. And what he describes is not tradition. It is not some honorable rite of passage. It is a system built by powerful men to keep their power, a system that used fear as its primary tool, a system that destroyed careers, broke bodies, and left deep psychological wounds in people who had done nothing wrong except walk through the door with talent and ambition. The stakes in that locker room were extraordinary. Your position on the card determined your pay. The matches you were booked into decided whether you could afford to eat. The opinion of the veterans about whether you were worth anything could make or break everything you had worked for. And all of that was controlled not by management in any transparent way, but by the men at the top of the locker room hierarchy. They were the gatekeepers. They decided who got through and who did not. And they were ruthless about protecting what they had. At the center of that world was a concept so simple and so corrupted it almost defies belief. Pay your dues. Work your way up. Earn the respect of the people above you. That sounds reasonable. That sounds like any other industry. But in the wrestling locker room of that era, paying dues often meant letting veterans physically hurt you in the ring without complaint. It meant accepting humiliation as part of the process. It meant never questioning the men who had been there long, no matter what those men were doing to you. The dues were not paid in hard work and quality matches. They were paid in suffering. And the men collecting those dues were not teaching the next generation. They were feeding their own need for control. There was also a brutally simple financial reality at the heart of all of this. Professional wrestling was not a sport with fixed salaries and guaranteed contracts in the way most careers work. Pay was tied to the gate, to the crowd, to the size of the venue and the heat of the program. When you were in the main event, you made real money. When you were on the secondary show, you made enough to keep going. The men at the top of the card had a direct financial incentive to keep the men below them exactly where they were. And every newcomer who got a main event spot was potentially taking money out of a veteran's pocket. And that economic reality made the bullying not just personal, but structural. It was written into the business itself. Jake Roberts calls the mid-90s era poisonous. He does not use that word lightly. He uses it because it is exactly the right word. Because a poison spreads, it gets into everything. It contaminates the people around it, even the ones who think they are safe. And this particular poison spread all the way through the locker room, through the card, through the business itself, and eventually into the ratings and the revenue and the the long-term health of the entire sport. But before we talk about all of that, we need to talk about the 10 people who felt it most directly. This is their countdown, starting at number 10 and working down to the man who felt the most iconic and devastating version of this culture. Every name matters. Every story counts. Here we go. Number 10, Leon White, Vader. Leon White, known to the world as Vader, is a story that comes in two completely different halves, and both halves are essential to understanding how the bullying culture of professional wrestling worked. You cannot tell one half without the other, because the full picture is what reveals the truth about power in that environment. In WCW, Vader was the physical enforcer. He was the man who ran the locker room through size and aggression. Roberts says it plainly. Vader was a bully. He would pull nonsense when he knew he could get away with it. That is calculated. That is not temperament. That is a man who looked around the room, assessed who was weaker, and used that weakness against them. He picked his targets carefully. He was not aggressive with bigger men. Roberts notes that Vader was noticeably more cautious around people like The Undertaker. His aggression was not about toughness. It was about opportunity. He bullied when the cost was low and the victim had no way to push back. The Orndorff incident in WCW changed something significant. Paul Orndorff, a veteran with a fearsome reputation, bested Vader in a backstage altercation while wearing flip-flops. That story spread through the locker room immediately, and it stripped Vader of the most important thing a locker room bully possesses. It stripped him of the belief that other people had in his invincibility. Once the aura of being unbeatable is gone, the power built on that aura dissolves with it. Vader did not stop being physically large after that, but he stopped being feared in the way he had been before. But then Vader came to the WWF, and in the WWF of the mid-1990s, the rules had changed completely. Physical size no longer gave you power. Political connection gave you power. And politically, Vader had nothing. He walked into a world he did not understand, armed with tools that no longer worked. The man who held that political power was Shawn Michaels. At SummerSlam 1996, Michaels was the champion and the leader of the Clique. During their match together, Vader missed a spot, and Michaels, in front of the cameras and the crowd and everyone watching at home, broke character to berate Vader in the ring. He humiliated him in public, in front of thousands of paying fans, as though no one else in the building mattered except Shawn Michaels and his need to make a point. The aftermath was complete destruction. Vader reportedly broke down in tears backstage. Michaels had threatened to end his main event push entirely. The man who had once been the most physically feared figure in the locker room was weeping because a smaller man with political connections had taken everything from him in a single night. Roberts describes Michaels during this period as behaving like a prime dickhead. He says Michaels used his proximity to management to block programs with performers he disliked, regardless of the money those programs could have generated. Vader was one of those performers. His career in the WWF never recovered. The physical bully of WCW had become the political victim of the WWF. And that transition tells you everything about how power actually worked in that world. Number 9, Mark Henry. Mark Henry arrived in the WWF as the world's strongest man. That was not a promotional nickname. That was a competitive title he had genuinely earned through legitimate athletic competition. He had competed in the Olympics. He had credentials that most wrestlers could not dream of. And the locker room saw all of that and decided that their job was to test him. The old guard did not like people who arrived through unconventional routes. The traditional path through the territories was a grueling one. Years of grinding in small halls for low pay, learning your craft under the eyes of experienced men, slowly earning the right to move up to bigger stages. Mark Henry had not done that. He had come in through a different door. And in the eyes of the veterans, that made him suspicious. That made him someone who had not earned his place. The signing bonus he came in with only made the resentment sharper. So they made his life difficult. The psychological hazing was constant and calculated. Veterans would challenge him, pick at him, question his right to be in the building at all, make comments in the locker room that were designed to be heard, create an atmosphere where Henry was never quite comfortable, never quite settled, never quite allowed to feel like he genuinely belonged in the company he had worked so hard to be part of. The goal was to unsettle him, to chip away at his confidence, to make sure he understood that no amount of strength or athleticism was going to shortcut the process they had decided he had to go through. And Mark Henry eventually became one of the most beloved figures the sport has ever produced. He endured it. He worked through it. He built himself into something extraordinary over many years of real dedication. But the path to that point was made much harder than it needed to be by men who saw a young prospect and decided the right response was to knock him down rather than help him develop. The testing of Mark Henry was not about making him better. It was about making the veterans feel secure. It was about maintaining the hierarchy. And it left a young man who deserved support and mentorship navigating a hostile environment that had no good reason to be hostile at all. Number 8, the Ultimate Warrior. The Ultimate Warrior stands as the most striking example of what happens when the locker room feels genuinely threatened. Because the Warrior was not not just popular, he was a phenomenon. The fans reacted to him in a way that went beyond anything technical or traditional. He connected with the audience on a visceral level that made the veterans deeply, deeply uncomfortable. He had not come up through the territories. He had not paid dues in the way the old guard defined it. He had arrived, got over fast, and started ascending toward the very top of the card in a way that bypassed all the systems the veterans believed in. And so the locker room responded with something coordinated and deliberate. They decided to sabotage him. Roberts explains that veterans would actively undermine the Warriors' matches. They would refuse to cooperate in the ring. They would not follow the script. They would put him in positions where he looked physically weak and technically exposed. The objective was transparent. They wanted to send a message to management. The message was this: this man is not the real thing. He does not belong in the main event. Do not trust him with the top spot. Even Andre the Giant was deployed in this effort. Andre would test the Warrior by refusing to work with him properly, by physically imposing himself in ways that made the match a trial rather than a performance. The Warrior was being set up to fail, night after night, but the fans were not listening. The crowds kept responding to the Warrior with genuine and enormous passion. He was getting over in spite of everything being done to derail him. And the more the audience cheered, the more resentment built in the locker room, because the Warriors' success made a lie of the system. It proved that you did not need their approval. You did not need their endorsement. You could connect with an audience through energy and commitment, even if the veterans never respected you. The animosity toward the Warrior lasted for decades. It outlasted his career. It followed him everywhere. And Roberts, reflecting honestly on this years later, came to understand something important. The men who spent all that energy trying to destroy the Warrior were doing themselves just as much damage. They were living in a permanent state of defensiveness, always watching their backs, always looking for the next threat to their position. The culture of bullying was consuming the bullies too. And by the time Roberts began the process of seeking reconciliation, so he understood that making amends was not just something he was doing for other people, it was something he desperately needed for himself. Number 7, Ahmed Johnson. Ahmed Johnson had everything the wrestling industry says it wants: the size, the look, the athleticism, an explosive physical presence that made audiences pay attention the moment he came through the curtain. Vince McMahon saw a major star in the making. The push was significant. The opportunity was real. The future looked genuinely bright, and then things went wrong. And they went wrong in a way that is complicated and uncomfortable and does not have a simple villain. Jake Roberts was asked by Vince McMahon personally to help Ahmed, to work with him, to pass on knowledge and experience that could help a raw talent develop into something exceptional. Roberts agreed. He set up a meeting, and Ahmed blew it off. He arrived late, and when Roberts challenged him on it, Ahmed looked at him and said he gets there when he wants to. Those words in that building, to that man, were a declaration of war. In the locker room of the 1990s, that attitude was not just disrespectful. It was a breach of the entire social contract. Veterans had a code. Newcomers listen, newcomers learn, newcomers show respect to the people who have been doing this longer. That is the deal. And when a newcomer walks in and makes it clear they do not consider that deal to apply to them, the response from the veterans is swift and physical. The receipts came. During Ahmed's feud with Ron Simmons, he suffered a serious kidney injury. Ahmed's own reading of the situation was that jealousy was behind it. That the people around him were threatened by his push and wanted to bring him down. But the locker room told a very different story. Mark Henry and others said plainly that Ahmed was hurting people every single night, that he was a dangerous worker, that matches with Ahmed were genuinely risky for the men sharing the ring with him. The truth sits somewhere between those two versions of events, and that is precisely the problem. Because even if Ahmed genuinely was reckless in the ring, the answer to that problem is never physical retaliation. It is never deliberate injury. That logic is circular and self-defeating. You cannot make the ring safer by making it more dangerous. You cannot teach someone to protect their opponent by hurting them. All you do is add more damage to an already broken system. And the locker room had decided it was above management, above authority, above any normal standard of accountability. And that was exactly what made the culture so poisonous in the first place. Ahmed's main event push never fully recovered. A career that had started with genuine momentum hit a wall that it could not get past. That is not justice. That is not discipline. That is a broken system enforcing its own broken logic on a young man who needed guidance, not violence. Number 6, Chris Candido. Chris Candido was a genuinely talented performer. He could work. He had real ability in the ring and the kind of instincts that you cannot teach. There was every reason for him to be a significant figure in the WWF. He had the tools. He had the drive. What he did not have was the protection of the people who controlled the political landscape of the locker room. His problem was not anything he had done. His problem was who he was with. Chris was the longtime partner of Tammy Sitch, known in the WWF as Sonny, and the treatment of Sonny in that locker room meant that Chris Candido was never going to to get a fair run. Because in that world, connection mattered. Association mattered. If the power group had decided to target someone in your life, the targeting did not stop at the boundaries of their career. It bled into yours. It became part of your story whether you wanted it to or not. The clique had their fingers in everything during this period. Their political maneuverings shaped who got pushed, who got buried, who got the good programs, and who got shuffled to the margins. And Chris Candido found himself in those margins not because of anything he had done wrong in the ring, but because the politics around him had made him an inconvenient presence. His push shrank, his opportunities dried up. The hostile environment that surrounded both him and Sonny became progressively more difficult to navigate, and eventually both of them departed from the WWF in circumstances that reflected the very real human cost of a workplace built on political manipulation and personal hostility. Chris Candido never got to show what he could really do at the highest level. That is a loss for him and a loss for the fans who never got to see what he was capable of. And the reason for that loss was not talent, it was politics. It was a deliberate and sustained campaign of exclusion against a man whose only real crime was loving the wrong person in the wrong building at the wrong time. Number 5, Sonny, Tammy Sytch. Tammy Sytch, known as Sonny, was one of the most popular personalities in the WWF during the 1990s. The audience loved her. Her connection with the crowd was real and consistent. Her contribution to the product during that era was genuine and significant. But behind the scenes, the treatment she received from the boys was something that Roberts describes as disgusting. And he does not mean that as a casual observation. He means it as a serious moral judgment about what was done to a person who deserved far better. The ribs that were played on Sonny were not practical jokes. They were not harmless fun. They were not the kind of backstage pranks that people laugh about years later. They were deliberate acts of humiliation. They were designed to degrade her, to make her feel small, to remind her constantly that in the eyes of the boys club, she was not a real colleague. She was a decoration, a prop, something to be used and discarded when the men around her decided they had no more use for her. The locker room culture of that era viewed female performers through a particular and ugly lens. They were not seen as athletes or artists or contributors to the business. They were viewed as disposable. That is the word Roberts uses. Disposable objects. People who could be replaced at any moment and who therefore did not deserve the basic respect that was afforded to the men in the locker room. The word disposable carries a specific weight. It means your feelings do not have to be considered. Your dignity is optional. Your comfort is irrelevant. What that looked like in practice was public shaming. Backstage pranks designed not for laughs but for damage. A sustained psychological environment that sent the same message every single day. You do not belong here. You are not one of us. And there is nothing you can do about it. The harm from that kind of sustained, targeted harassment does not switch off when you leave the building. It embeds itself in the way you think about yourself. It shapes the way you move through the world. It creates wounds that take years to understand and longer to heal. And the women who endured that treatment in the 90s wrestling locker room endured it without any recourse, without any protection. All right, without anyone in a position of power standing up and saying that this is not acceptable. What happened to Sonny was not tradition. It was not harmless. It was a culture of sustained cruelty directed at someone who had less power and less protection than the people tormenting her. And it was completely and utterly wrong. Number 4, Shane Douglas. Shane Douglas had done something real before he came to the WWF. He had built a reputation in ECW as a genuine star. He could talk, he could work, and the people who saw him perform knew they were watching someone with genuine ability. He came into the WWF with a track record and with real potential to succeed at the highest level. He was never given the chance. The Dean Douglas character was a school teacher, a pedantic and self-important figure who corrected other people's grammar and marked them down for their failures. It was the kind of character that many veterans and insiders believed had been deliberately designed to make success impossible. Not just a character that might struggle to get over, but a character that the people with creative influence had actively built to fail. The political friction between Douglas and the clique was real and it was significant, and it translated directly into what happened to his career. His matches were undermined. His promos were made to look foolish. The top stars who controlled who got to succeed in that environment were simply not going to allow Shane Douglas to flourish, because allowing Douglas to flourish meant passing the torch to someone new. It meant taking a small step back so that someone else could take a step forward. And in that locker room, that was too much to ask. Roberts is clear about this. When top stars refuse to pass the torch, when they use their creative influence to make a newcomer's character look worthless, that is a form of bullying. It is career-ending bullying carried out through institutional power rather than physical force. It is cleaner. It leaves no visible marks, but the damage is just as real. Douglas left the company. His time in the WWF is a chapter defined by squandered potential control and political malice. And the fans are the ones who ultimately paid the price, because they never got to see what Shane Douglas could have done if the people around him had chosen collaboration over sabotage. Or number 3, Bam Bigelow. When Jake Roberts talks about Bam Bigelow, there is something in his voice that sounds like genuine grief, because Bigelow was the kind of talent that comes along rarely. A man of his size who could move the way he moved, who could do what he did in the ring, was genuinely exceptional. Roberts says it direct, unbelievable talent, spectacular movement for a man of his size. Bigelow was not just good, he was the kind of good that could draw money at the very top of the card. He had everything, and the system made sure he never got to use it where it mattered most. Roberts describes what he calls a segregation within the company during this era. Certain performers were kept on secondary programs, shows that existed to warm up the audience in smaller markets before the main attraction arrived. Yes, these secondary performers would work hard. They would earn reactions, they would do everything right, and then the top stars would walk in, take the main event spotlight and the lion's share of the revenue, and move on to the next city. While Bigelow and the others on the secondary shows went home knowing that no matter what they did, the ceiling was fixed above their heads and they were not going to break through it. Roberts uses a specific phrase, getting the city ready. That was Bigelow's role in the eyes of the clique and the top stars of that era. He was useful, he was valuable for warming audiences up, but he was never going to be the attraction, because the people who controlled the narrative of who was main event material had decided that Bigelow getting that recognition might take something away from their own standing. And they were not willing to risk it. The tragedy of Bam Bigelow is the tragedy of squandered drawing power. The fans who watched him perform saw something special. They responded to him. There was money in that response, real money that could have been made from programs featuring Bigelow at the top of the card. But that money was never made, because the gatekeepers kept the gate closed, because protecting their position mattered more to them than building something genuinely great. And that loss was not just Bigelow's loss. It was not just a loss for a talented man who deserved better. It was a loss for the product itself, for the industry, and for everyone who wanted to see the best possible version of wrestling and never got it because the men at the top were more concerned with protecting their position than building something great. Number 2, Jake Roberts. This name might surprise you, because Jake Roberts is the man telling these stories. He is the witness. He is the conscience of this account. But he is also on this list because the man pointing the finger has also had the finger pointed at him. He has been the victim. He has felt it in his own body. And his experience with Vader is one of the most direct and documented examples of physical bullying in the history of professional wrestling. At the King of the Ring in 1996, Jake Roberts and Vader were booked against each other. Vader was an enormous man, known for his stiff style, known for working in a way that was harder and more physical than most of his contemporaries. During their match, Vader performed a corner splash. His full weight came down on Roberts, and Roberts walked out of that building with a broken sternum. He confronted Vader. He asked why. He wanted an explanation for what had happened to his body in that ring, and Vader told him he had been excited by the crowd. That was it. Excitement. As though excitement is a justification for breaking your opponent's bones. As though the feeling of the crowd response removes your professional responsibility to protect the man you are working with. Roberts had carried out the fundamental obligation of professional wrestling. He had protected Vader, and Vader had not returned that protection. 6 weeks later, the company came back to Roberts and asked him to work with Vader again. Roberts refused. He said he would not do it. He told them to find someone else. And in a world where saying no to management could end your push overnight, that refusal took real courage, because Roberts was protecting himself, because nobody else was going to do it. The company was not going to do it. The locker room was not going to do it. He had to draw the line himself and live with the consequences. The sternum broke a second time, and Roberts drew a line, quietly, without drama, without making a scene. He simply said he was not going to keep being a victim, because the system expected him to absorb whatever was done to him without complaint. That line was an act of dignity in a world that had very little respect for dignity. Roberts was not just a narrator of this era. He was inside it. He felt it in his bones, literally. And the fact that he now speaks about it with such honesty, with such willingness to include his own vulnerability in the telling, is part of what makes his account so credible and so important. Number 1, Randy Savage. The number 1 spot, and perhaps the most revealing one on this entire list, because Randy Savage was not a timid man. He was not someone who backed down. He was not soft. He was one of the most driven, most focused, most intensely professional performers in the history of professional wrestling. The Macho Man, a man who prepared for everything, who controlled every element of his performance, who brought an obsessive commitment to his craft that few people have ever matched. He was intense in a way that could fill every corner of a room the moment he walked into it, and he was totally terrified of Andre the Giant. That is the honest account. Totally terrified. Not intimidated, not wary, terrified. And when you understand what Andre represented in that locker locker room, you understand exactly why. Andre the Giant occupied the role of locker room policeman in the era he presided over. He enforced order through physical dominance. His treatment of other performers was a ritualized test of their worthiness. If Andre decided a wrestler was light, if he decided they lacked the toughness or the stiffness to belong at that level, he would respond by tossing them around the ring like a rag doll. He would physically punish them in front of everyone, and there was no appeal. There was no process. There was only Andre's judgment on that particular night. His verdict was final, and it was delivered with an enormous body and absolute certainty. For a man like Randy Savage, this was a nightmare scenario. Savage was a planner. He wanted to know the shape of what was going to happen before it happened. He wanted to trust the environment he was working in. He wanted certainty. He wanted control. He had built his entire professional identity around the ability to prepare for every variable. And Andre represented a variable that simply could not be prepared for. Andre's mood determined everything. His assessment of you on any given night could mean the difference between a professional performance and a brutal public punishment with no warning and no way out. Think about what that does to you over time, night after night. Building to the next encounter, wondering what version of Andre you're going to get this time. Whether tonight is a night where things go smoothly or a night where you get reminded in front of everyone that your preparation counts for nothing. That no matter how good you are, there is someone in this building who can unmake all of it in a moment. That kind of sustained psychological pressure does not just affect your performance on those specific nights. It shapes the way you carry yourself, the way you approach every working relationship, the way you think about trust and safety in the ring. Roberts himself experienced the full weight of Andre's power in a different way. During a match, Andre performed a splash in the corner, and while Roberts was trapped and unable to move, intentionally passed wind on him. In veteran circles, well, this story gets told with laughs. It gets recounted as one of those colorful tales from a wilder era. But look at it honestly. Look at what it actually is. A physically dominant man, knowing the other person cannot move or respond or defend themselves, chooses to do something deliberately degrading in that moment of complete vulnerability. It is not a prank. It is a demonstration of absolute power. I can do whatever I want to you, and you will smile and say nothing. Because if you complain, you are weak, and if you retaliate, you will get destroyed. That is the reality that Randy Savage lived with. That constant, simmering awareness that Andre could alter the nature of reality in the ring whenever he chose to. That professionalism did not protect you. That preparation did not protect you. That excellence in your craft gave you no immunity from being made to look like nothing if the most powerful man in the building decided tonight was your night to suffer. And the locker room accepted all of this. They more than accepted it. They celebrated it. Because Andre was the enforcer, he was the one keeping the standards. He was the mechanism by which the hierarchy reproduced itself. And the hierarchy needed to keep reproducing itself because too many powerful men had too much invested in its continuation. The system needed its policemen, and nobody stopped to ask what the policing was costing the people being policed. Randy Savage endured it. He went on to become one of the most celebrated performers the sport has ever produced. He built a legacy that will outlast everyone who ever frightened him. But that legacy does not redeem the system that put him through what he went through. Enduring something terrible and succeeding, despite it, does not make the terrible thing acceptable. It just means the person was stronger than the damage, and they should never have had to be. So there they are, counting down from 10 to 1. Vader, Mark Henry, the Ultimate Warrior, Ahmed Johnson, Chris Candido, Sonny, Shane Douglas, Bam Bigelow, Jake Roberts, Randy Savage. 10 names, 10 stories, 10 examples of a culture that called itself tradition while doing the work of something far darker and far more destructive. Each of these people paid a price. Each of them walked into a building where the rules were designed to serve the people who had already made it and to break the people who were still trying. Each of them had their story shaped by a system that had decided before they ever got there that they were either a threat or a prop or a body to absorb punishment. And each of them deserved something completely different to what they got. But this story does not end in the dark because the wrestling industry changed slowly and imperfectly and not without setbacks, but it genuinely changed. As the era Roberts describes gave way to something different, something that still has its flaws and its politics and its moments of unfairness, but that operates by fundamentally different rules than the world where Randy Savage walked in fear and Bam Bigelow was told to get the city ready and Sonny was told that she was disposable. Roberts himself has criticisms of the modern era. He sees things he does not like. He misses elements of the older approach to psychology and storytelling in the ring. But even Roberts, with all those criticisms, acknowledges that the decline of the bullying culture has made the industry safer. The recklessness that broke his sternum twice has been replaced by a working style built on cooperation, on shared responsibility, on the understanding that protecting your opponent is not weakness. It is the most fundamental professional standard in the entire sport. And then there is the reconciliation, because that is the part of this story that matters most lost in the end. Jake Roberts, after years of animosity, after all the resentment and the defensiveness and the bitterness that built up across decades of this life, sought to make amends with the Warrior, with others who had been part of the same poisonous story from different sides of it. He describes that process as a huge weight being lifted, not just from his conscience, but from his entire way of moving through the world. Because the truth about the bullying culture is this: it damaged the victims, obviously and visibly and without question, but it also damaged the perpetrators. And the men who spent years using fear as a management strategy became men who were constantly afraid themselves, afraid of the next person coming up behind them, afraid of losing the spot they had fought so hard to keep, afraid that the toughness they performed every day might be revealed as performance rather than reality. They built walls to keep other people out and then had to live behind those walls themselves. The bully is never truly free. Making amends lifted that weight. Choosing truth over self-protection lifted that weight. And the industry that is now emerging from the long shadow of that poisonous era is lighter for it. Not perfect, not finished, but genuinely moving in a direction that respects the people who make it work, who perform in the ring every single night and put their bodies and their careers on the line for an audience that deserves the best possible version of what this sport can be. The performers of today work in a safer environment because the people who came before them paid a price that eventually became too visible to ignore. Jake Roberts has named his 10. He has told their stories. He has lifted the curtain on a culture that the industry spent decades pretending was just the way things were done. He has held that culture up to the light and named it for what it was. Not tradition, not professionalism, not toughness. Bullying. Plain and ugly and real. He has held the locker room culture of the 80s and 90s up to the light and refused to let anyone pretend it was just the way things were. It was a choice. It made by powerful people who knew what they were doing and chose to keep doing it. And the people on this list paid for that choice with their bodies, their careers, their mental health, and years of their lives. The truth has been told. The names have been counted down from 10 to 1. And from here, the only direction worth going is forward. That is the final lesson from the snake pit. Face the truth. Name what was wrong. Build something better on top of it.